remote administration. In this nugget, we take a look at remote administration, where we're able to reach out and assist other users. And you can either view their desktop or, with their permission, even control their keyboard and mouse and fully administer their destination computer. You can also use remote desktop. This is where you just want to connect to a remote destination so that you can get work done. And you're not in that remote destination, but you need to use the computer in that remote destination. And then this is going to give you pretty much, again, the same productivity as if you were seated there. We also take a look here at remote management. You need to use the WinRM command to be able to enable remote management on a destination machine so that you can, from the command line, perform various functions. And also, you need to be able to run Windows PowerShell sometimes. This is an extremely powerful scripting language that allows you to do virtually anything that can be done to a Windows machine. And now you can also do that remotely as well. All right, first of all, let's take a look at this idea of remote assistance. This is actually something that debuted in Windows XP and is largely unchanged since then, except that in Windows XP, when you would use this, then you could also have a voice chat over the network, whereas now they don't offer that anymore, and you'll have to use the phone line or something like that if you want to have a verbal conversation with the other person. But here we will have two users. The first person involved in this is the helper, and the second person is the host. The helper in XP used to be called the expert, all right? And the host in Windows XP used to be called the novice. But of course, this didn't seem politically correct enough because this seemed like a superior term, and this was inferior, and so that didn't seem politically correct enough. So now it's been changed to helper for the IT person, the expert, and a host for the person needing assistance. Hopefully now nobody's feelings are going to get hurt. Oh, this reminds me, there's a major university system that I work with, and if I were to name them, you would know right away who they are. But they have an initiative going on within their help desk departments right now, or their IT departments, to stop using the term users. Why? Because it's demeaning to them. It might hurt their precious little feelings. So anyway, this is just neither here nor there, but this is what we have. We have two people involved in this, and then the focus on this is going to be on help desk kind of scenarios where somebody doesn't understand how to do something, or they've got a problem with their computer, and they need somebody to help them along with it. This is something that, of course, could possibly be done with just mental pictures, more or less, or trying to mirror what they're doing on your side as a help desk personnel with maybe a virtual machine or something like that. But that's not always going to be quite what we need. I mean, for example, whenever my wife needs help, I got to lower my voice so she doesn't hear me. Whenever my wife needs help with her computer, she uses expressions like this. She'll say something like, well, I can't find the thing on the left. When I click on it, then the thing on the right pops up, and I'm not really sure how to get it to go away. Like, I have any idea what in the world any of that means. Well, this is a situation in which a help desk with remote assistance could be very useful, because then you can both see and see the same thing, and potentially also the helper in this could also remotely control the keyboard and the mouse. This all circulates around an invitation. The host side of this, the person requiring help, needs to send an invitation, and it can be done a number of different ways. It can be done by file, so they can just save a file to a specified location. This would be useful if both parties were on the same network as in a corporate environment. If they're not on the same network, like over the internet help or something, they could use email, and they could email you an invitation, which is by default good for 6 hours, and so then you can take advantage of that. All I have to do is double-click on it from another current Windows machine. And then finally, you can also use something called Easy Connect, and this depends upon a specific service to be running, and it's not always available in all environments. This also requires IP version 6. So this may not work at all across a lot of internet connections, because some points from point A to point B may not support IP version 6 yet. And as I mentioned earlier, there can be a degree of control in terms of how much the helper is able to control the keyboard and mouse. Well, the host will control whether or not they can, and whether or not they even remain connected. So if at any time the host feels that they're uncomfortable with what's going on there somehow, or maybe there's personal data up on the screen that they don't want the helper to see, then they can also either pause the session, more or less, or they can also just disconnect it entirely if they like. And then in order to enable remote assistance, you have to go to the System Control Panel on the Remote tab where you can see I am right now. And then you would check this Allow Remote Assistance Connections to this computer, and the advanced options will allow you to do things such as configure whether or not it can be controlled remotely by the helper, and then how long the invitations can remain open. This is it's a default setting, and it's probably a reasonable amount of time considering that some troubleshooting scenarios might take a couple hours or so and might take a while for the person to receive the invitation and open it and so forth. But you don't want to make them too long because that could potentially open up a security vulnerability. For additional security, you can also create invitations that can only be used from computers running Windows Vista or later because they handle the cryptography of the invitation differently there. Okay, so that's how you would, first of all, enable any kind of remote assistance. All right, now let's take a look at how this whole thing could work. Let's say that the person who's logged on to this computer right now, which is Phoenix User 02, maybe they're having trouble, maybe they have a vision impairment or something, and maybe the text is too small for them to read. Most people can probably read this just fine, but for them it's a little bit of a challenge. So they want to know how they can make this more visible to themselves. So what they would do here then is they would simply go to All Programs and Maintenance, and then there's a Windows Remote Assistance link right here. Once they select that item, they can say, invite someone you trust to help you. And then you can send email to send an invitation, but I don't have an email client installed on this computer. Windows Vista and Windows 7 no longer have a default client like Outlook Express that we used to have in previous versions of Windows. You have to download Windows Live if you want the free email client. So I'm not going to do that one, but it's easy enough. You just click there, and it will generate a blank email with an attachment already in it. I'm just going to save the invitation as a file to a file share that I know the other person also has access to. And I just kind of created a share here for this. And I'll just say invitation. Now, of course, you can name this whatever you want, and it might make more sense if you name it the user's name or something like this. But regardless, in this case, I know there's only a single invitation there, so I'm just going to go ahead and allow that to take place. And then we also have this right here. This is a password that the helper has to know. And so you're probably going to be on the phone, and whoever is the host is going to read aloud to you this password. Or if they also have other methods, maybe they could chat it to you. By the way, this can also be opened up in chat. So if you use like Microsoft chat products, then you can also open up an invitation using that method as well. So anyway, I'm waiting for an incoming connection because I've gone ahead and saved this. I can minimize this to get out of my way if I want to continue to do other things while I'm waiting for the invitation to be accepted. And then on the helper side of things, I will locate the invitation that user has saved out for me. I'm going to quickly just open this in Notepad for sake of novelty, if nothing else. Not part of the exam, but this is how the ticket looks. You can see it's actually an XML ticket, and in here somewhere is the code that we're supposed to enter in. This is all encrypted. So if you can figure out what that is, then you're a smarter person than I am, which is not hard to do, but I will probably never be able to figure out what the password is by looking at all of that because it's all encrypted. Anyway, other things we have here are the computer that we're trying to remote administer or remote assist. That's at this IP address, and then there's a colon followed by a number. That means that that's the port number on this IP address. Then we also see the date that it was date and time that it was created. This is actually not in a normal format that we see, but that's what that is. That's the date and time. And then this is 6 hours because it's 360 minutes that we see there. And then you'll double click on this item, and then you'll enter in the remote assistance dialog box that pops up the remote assistance password, and then you'll click OK. Now from this point, what's going to happen is the person who's seeking remote assistance will receive an invitation item on their or a prompt on their desktop, and it says, would you like James Conrad to help you? And I'll say, sure, yes. And then once they say yes, then what they'll see here is, and this is their actual desktop that we see in the background here, and then what I'm dragging in here is my own remote desktop, a remote assistance window that I see as the helper. Okay, so we're actually kind of seeing both. In the foreground here is the helper's screen. The background is the host screen. All right? So we're both sharing this interface right now. Notice that I can't actually do anything. I can't click on anything. I can't click the start menu. The keyboard won't work or anything. So I'm going to go back over to this side of things where the user is. And then here we see a toolbar that's available to that user. And it says that the helper can now see my desktop. We can start a chat if we want to, where they can send a question. Can you see my desktop? which they would know if they just read the bottom of this thing here. But anyway, they're asking that question, and over here on the host or the helper side of things, it kind of crams the window. It's a little bit hard to read, but we see that there's a message that came from that user. Can you see my desktop? And I'll just send back yes, just real quick here. I'm going to try to be quick about this. Oops. Yes. That would really throw them, wouldn't it? If I said no, then what would they do? I don't know. So then they'll see the answer come back on their side of things. Then what we can do here is on the settings, actually let me pause for a moment. We could also click on pause, and what that would do is on the helper screen, which we can see right here, they get a big pause button, and they will then know that something's going on that user's side of things. Maybe they received an email that had confidential information in it, and they didn't want that to be publicly available or available to the help desk personnel that's trying to help them out. So that could be one of the scenarios there. Then once the host is completed with the privacy issue there, then they can click continue, and then we can see again on the helper screen that they now again have the screen available to them. And now then it could be that the host is having difficulty understanding what I'm trying to tell them to do in terms of increasing the font size and all that. By the way, speaking of font size and hard to read, if this gets to be too compressed and squishy and all to be able to read, that's a really technical term, squishy, then you can turn off the chat, and that helps to restore a little bit of screen control here. Then what I could do is I could say, you know what, I'm just going to ask if I can take control of your computer, so I'm going to request control right now. And then on their side of things, which is again right here, this is their actual desktop, they can say allow him to respond to user account control prompts. Okay, that would be useful for escalating administrative privilege if they had to do something that required a system change. And then they will click on yes. All right. Now what will happen here is this administrator will have to enter in their credentials. Then having done that, they'll just go ahead and connect. And now what can happen here is, and again, this is the host side of things, so there's nothing unusual about that. But here on the helper side of things, I can click stop sharing, actual size to make it a little bit easier to read, and so forth. But here, what I want to do is to identify for this user how they can make this easier to read. So what I'm trying to tell them is they can press, the control plus sign. So I can just tell them that and just demonstrate to them how that makes things bigger and smaller. Or I can hold down the Alt key or press the Alt key and choose View, and then to show them here how there's a zoom option here where they can control in, or again where they can also then change the zoom options to zoom out. And then there's also a text size item there if they want as well. But you get the idea here. It doesn't really matter how we zoom in or out. What matters is that I'm now able to directly interact with their desktop and to give them some assistance with this. Now when we're done, I'll just click on Stop Sharing. But likewise, on the user's side of things, on the host side, they might say, okay, I guess they're done helping me now, and I have some personal files to open and things, so I want to stop sharing. It's as simple as that. Just click Stop Sharing, and that's pretty much the end of it. Okay. Now there will be no more sharing of that computer. However, they still will be able to see the desktop and all, they just can't control the keyboard or mouse. So if I close that entirely, that dialog box entirely, then they're completely kicked out. This is the helper side of things, and you can see I'm pretty much just blanked out right now, so that's the end of that support call. Also, it's kind of useful to know about these remote assistance settings in group policy. This is really only going to be useful on a Active Directory group policy object as opposed to a local policy, because this will allow me to configure all of the remote assistance sharing settings in a broad scope. And it's under Computer Configuration Policies, Administrative Templates, System, and then down here there's a remote assistance item. The two that are probably the most useful are the solicited remote assistance, which is what the user just did, where they sent me an invitation asking for help. Well, we can enable that, and then we can choose whether or not we want them to remotely control or only view the computer, the maximum time in hours for the ticket to be good for, and the method for sending email invitations, which method they use for mail, either mail to or the simple MAPI. So it just kind of depends upon what you're set up for in your environment. And then you can also offer remote assistance. We haven't really talked about that here quite yet, but what this is, if I enable this, it allows me to send out an invitation to the user regardless of whether or not they have asked for any help. Actually, let me go back into that. So if I enable that, it allows me again to remotely control or only view, but here if I click Show, then this allows me to add in various accounts. Although I find that it's too bad that there's not really a browse button or a find button there for locating the Active Directory accounts, but you would have to manually type in the domain and the username. Okay, but at least it's available there. Now, once you have set it up so that it can offer remote assistance, then here on a Windows Server 2008 server, there's this item right here, offer to help someone, and then I can enter an invitation file again at a certain location, and then I can also enter in their computer name or IP address. This top option is really just the same thing that the user does if it's a solicited remote assistance where they created the invitation and are out asking for help. This is the offer item where I'm just going to type in their computer name, and then we'll see if they respond, and they should get a prompt on the screen asking them if they want any help with anything. Now then there's Remote Desktop. Now this has a different emphasis, and it uses a single user. Okay, you've seen me using Remote Desktop for most of this whole series, even though you may not have realized that I was using Remote Desktop at various times. For example, even here where I was showing you group policy just moments ago, this is my Windows Server 2008 server for NuggetLab.com, my domain controller. That's a Remote Desktop connection. See right there? dc1nugget1.nuggetlab.com. This is a connection made over the network. It just looks like I'm actually seated at that desktop right here. Okay, it's kind of a little trick I play to run multiple computers at once, even though I might only have one physical set of hardware that I do recordings from. So how do I actually make all of this happen? Well, first of all, you also have to understand that, again, it's for a single user, and the focus here is really on productivity. It's not a help desk kind of a thing. It's just, oh, doggone it, I forgot to fill out my TPS reports before I left the office. So then, when I get home to my home computer, I create a remote desktop connection back to my office machine, and I can fully administer and fully work with it as if I were seated locally at that machine. The only thing I can't really do, to some degree, is to plug in certain devices and do anything that requires physical hardware changes. When I make this remote desktop connection, the remote computer, if it was not locked at the time, will become locked so that other people cannot see the actions that I'm performing on that computer while I am away. And then also, if there was a previous connection already on it, for example, maybe with user switching, there might be two people simultaneously logged on to that computer. Let's say user 1 and user 2. All right. Now, user 2 also wants to make a remote desktop connection while this person is currently in a live session, okay, seated at the console. If I try to create a remote desktop session, then person 1 will receive a message that I'm trying to make a connection, and then they can cancel that attempt at making a remote desktop connection by clicking on cancel, or they can click, I can't honestly remember, it's either yes or okay, and they'll click that, and it will allow that person to make a connection. At that point, they will be locked out of the computer, however. Now, don't be concerned about that because any documents they were working on and so forth are still saved and their applications are still open. It's pretty much the same as user switching, fast user switching. That's really all that's gone on with that. So then, how do I go about making remote desktop available? What you'll do is you'll right-click on the computer here and choose Properties. Once you're in this, you'll choose the Remote Settings, and then you'll select whichever one of these you want. By default, it says don't allow connections to this computer. Mine's dimmed out because I'm forcibly enabling these settings by using a group policy object. And when you do that, it will disable any options that are no longer available. But the best option to choose is the last one, which is where you're going to also use network level authentication. This confirms the parties in the transaction so that you can make sure that there's nobody that's spoofing a machine and trying to be an imposter, so to speak. Then you can also select which users that can make the connections. If you decide to use this one, you may have to do that if you have older Windows clients that are trying to make a remote desktop connection setting, and they're using an older client, such as Windows XP. Now, you can make Windows XP compatible with this last option, but it has to be running Service Pack 3, and it has to be running a current client and be updated. Also, you're going to need to discreetly select which users you want to make connections. By default, anybody who's a member of the local administrators group can already make a connection, and you don't have to manually pick out their names here. Also, anybody who's a member of the Remote Desktop Users Local Security Group. That's the name of a local group. And if they're a member of that group, they will also be able to make a connection. Now, when I select users here, anybody I add in here automatically gets added into that Remote Desktop Users local group. This is just two different interfaces to be able to do that. I can use this interface, or I could use the local administrative tools to add users or groups into that security group. Now here I've kind of made it broad for domain users. That might be useful if you have kiosk machines or something that you want to be publicly available. Otherwise, you'll just want to be selective about who is able to remotely log on to this computer that way. But of course, once you're done, you'll just close all of that up, and click OK past everything. And then what you'll do is you're going to go ahead and make a connection using a current copy of the remote desktop client. So then in order to make the connection, what you'll need to do is to enter in the computer name here. I've entered in the fully qualified domain name, provided that there's a DNS server that can resolve that. You can also enter in the flat namespace if you can use NetBIOS names on a single subnet, or if you have a Win server that can resolve the name for you. And then you can also, of course, use the IP address. Now, one thing that's also useful, especially if you need to connect maybe to a home PC or a small office PC, is you might be using dynamic DNS, because your ISP will frequently change your IP address that comes into your home or small office. And for that, what I'll often use is this company here, dynamicdns.com. You can get a free account from them, and it will monitor the IP address that the ISP is using for you, and then it'll change it, and you'll be set up with a specific name, and then you can connect by fully qualified domain name. DNS servers on the internet will resolve it through DNS, dynamic DNS, and then it will make the connection for you. You don't need to memorize any of that for the exam, but you just need to be able to make a connection. So then what you'll do is just click on Connect, and then you'll enter in a password. You can also save the password, but be judicious about that, because then anybody who has access to your machine could potentially be able to gain access to it. And then we'll go ahead and connect. And then what it does is it secures that remote connection. That's part of what's involved when I was mentioning earlier that it will perform network level authentication. You can see here then that we have now connected. That's pretty much it. Now I'll just use this the same way as I would if I were seated locally at that machine. Oh, also, there's another thing I want to point out here. In the printers, things like printers, if I don't really have any more than one, I guess, but if I had more than one actual installed printer besides this default right here, then it would say something like the name of the printer, and in parentheses underneath it, it might say redirected or something like that. And that's because it will allow me to print to my local printers where I am actually physically seated, as opposed to the printers that are on the remote destination. And that might be useful because I'm trying to print out a print job, then I don't want it to print miles away in that remote office. I want it to print on the printer that's right behind me. Also, I just want to show you some of the properties of the remote desktop connection. If you click on the options down here, then it will expand this out and give you various tabs that you can work with here. For example, one thing it allows you to do is to save credentials, like I mentioned earlier. You can also change the display settings to go to full screen if you want. Nowadays, you can also even use this so that it will go across multiple monitors. So you can say use all my monitors for the remote session. That's actually what I do. I actually have a two-headed configuration where I have two separate monitors that expand the desktop horizontally across my desk. And then you can also choose some other self-explanatory options here as well. Now, I was just talking about printers, I think. Here, if you select printers, then what you're going to be able to see is the ability to connect those local and remote printers together. There's some additional options here as well, such as whether or not you can use drives. Now, for example, if I select this option, then all of these drive letters will appear on the remote machine, even though they may not have any of these drive letters or resources on their own. You do got to be careful about that, because what if I had a virus on drive D and then I made a connection to my office computer? Well, that virus could get transmitted to drive D on the office computer. So you do have to be somewhat judicious about that particular item. But those are some of the things that you'll have available as options. Then if you want to start up only a specific program on connection, that might be, again, useful for certain kiosk machines, for example, or trade show machines where you want to run a specific application. Then it'll go ahead and run that application for you. There's also group policy options that you can configure that will run that program exclusively, and there's nothing else they do. There's not even a start menu that will appear that they can click on. There's also on the experience item, you can specify how visually it appears depending upon the available bandwidth. And again, these things kind of explain themselves. And then the Advanced tab talks about the server authentication. This actually uses certificates, and if there appears to be a problem with the certificate, such as the name of the connection that you're trying to make does not match the name in the certificate, then it may warn you, and you can click yes or no to go ahead and connect there anyway if you want. Oh, and this thing down here is the Connect from Anywhere item. What this does is it allows you to use an HTTPS connection so that you don't have to use a VPN or some other method like that to be able to access a desktop that's behind like corporate firewalls and NAT translators and things of this nature. You have to set up server settings for this item here as well, however. But anyway, once you're done with all of that, you simply enter in the credentials that you want to use, and then you click on Connect, and you're going to find yourself in a full desktop session. An additional way of remotely managing a host is to use something called the Windows Remote Management Service, or WinRM. In order to configure this on the remote target that I want to control, I'm going to type in this from an administrative command prompt: WinRM space quick config. It's really that simple. All this is going to really do is it's going to start the WinRM service to a delayed automatic start. And delay auto start simply means that it will start automatically, but it's going to wait a little while so that it doesn't contend with other services and applications that are trying to launch right during the system startup, and that will hopefully help performance a little bit. Also, it will grant administration remotely. There's a certain account that goes on with that. Then it will turn on the WinRM listener at http:// and then star. Okay, so it turns on a listener at this location that allows it to receive any attempts at remote administration using WinRM. And then it also creates a firewall exception automatically that would allow these connections to come through. Be aware of the fact as well that if you are running in a non-Active Directory environment, either one of the computers is not an Active Directory, either the source or the remote target, either one, then you may need to add a trust item there, and I'll show you what you need to do in order to make that happen. You can also just use a group policy object to make the trust as well. The first method here uses a command line. The second here, of course, would use just the conventional group policy objects. So, for example, here I am on one of the machines that I use a lot for our demonstrations and things like that. It's called Win7Ent64, as in Windows 7 Enterprise 64-bit edition, and I want to run a command prompt as an administrator. And then once I've done that, I'll do WinRM space quick config. That's pretty much it. Once you type all of that in and prompt yes to the changes that it's going to try to make, then it's going to go ahead and do all of the things that it needs to do, make the changes to the firewall, to the service, and so forth. That's pretty much it. Now you can see here that it's going to create a WinRM listener on that specific location so that I can then remotely administer to this machine. And again, this is the machine that I'm going to try to control remotely. This is the destination. Now on the source computer, which I've just made a different wallpaper color so that we can easily identify them, this is the source where I might actually be seated locally. Then this is the one that I want to use as the one that is remotely controlling the destination. If I want to configure a trust involved in this, let me show you what I'd do. I'd go to command prompt to run as administrator again on this source computer because I need to add the destination computer as a trusted computer. Let me show you what I would type in here. And this is not going to be necessary in my case because both the computers are in the same domain, so there's kind of an implicit trust already there. But if they were not, then this is what I would type in. I just enter this in WinRM set and then WinRM /config/client. Notice that there's no spaces in any of that. And then squiggly bracket here, trusted hosts, notice the capitalization, equals, and then in quotation marks, you have to use the quotation marks, whatever the IP address is or the host name is of the destination. I don't really need to do that in my case because I'm using Active Directory domain, so this should be fine. And then there are also group policy object items here that you can see on my domain controller underneath computer configuration policies, Windows templates. Then we go down to Windows components here, and then Windows remote management. Let me expand out a little bit, and you'll see we do have a Windows remote management with both a client piece and a service piece right here. Now, we don't need to exhaust all of these, but one thing I do want to point out is that over here on the WinRM client side, you can add in trusted hosts in a list like this. Okay, so you can do that as opposed to doing the command line item I mentioned earlier. Now, this is going to be especially useful if, of course, this is going to apply to a domain. So we do have Active Directory, but if the trusted hosts that we're trying to remotely administer are in a work group or something like this, and sometimes this might be the case with web servers. Sometimes web servers not always part of a domain, so you might try doing it with something like that. Now, once I've gone ahead and configured the client side so that it will listen, and WinRM quick config over on that other computer there, then I'm ready to start doing remote administration here from an elevated command prompt. And for this, I'll do WinRS for Windows Remote Shell. That's what that stands for. -R, which means I'm pointing out what the remote computer is. And that remote computer is going to be, what is the name of that? Win7ENT64. Okay, and I could do .nuggetlab.com, or I could do the IP address, whatever I can use to be able to reach it. And then you can do whatever command you're interested in. For example, maybe I'm interested in finding out what drivers are running over on that destination. Then I might do driver query, and this would run this query the same as if I had typed it on that destination machine, except that the results are going to spit out on this machine that I'm currently using. And then you can see the result right here. It just spit out all the results of all the drivers that are currently in use. That might be useful if I'm having troubleshooting issues over there and I need to identify which drivers are loading. Maybe it's an older driver that I did not expect to see. Also, if you need to enter in some credentials, I'm going to repeat that command here. And then we could also add in a couple of other things here. We could do a -u:, and then the name of the user. For example, it would be NuggetLab \trainer. And then you can also enter in the password here. If you don't enter in a password, then it'll prompt you for a password. Okay, and I like to do that because I don't like to type in my password in plain text because it would be plainly visible there and someone could see it. But if I wanted to do a password, then I would have done the same thing up here. And then on the end of this, I would have typed in -p:, and then password right here. I'm kind of running out of space there. SSWORD. Whatever the password is would appear in that space right there. Alright, now, once I've enabled Windows Remote Management on a destination computer, which again, remember, is this computer right here. That's the one where I ran Windows Remote Management. Then I can remotely administer it from this computer, this other system. It could be halfway around the planet, for all we know. Then what I want to do here is, in addition to running Windows Remote Shell, I can do other things as well, such as PowerShell. PowerShell is a scripting language. It's probably the most powerful scripting language that we have available right now, and you can touch virtually every aspect of a Windows operating system. In fact, even parts of the operating system for which there's no UI. There's no other way to get to it. This is a very deep level of administration, and it's Microsoft's emerging and favorite way of administering Windows. In fact, current versions of Exchange are actually largely based on PowerShell. If you want to learn more about PowerShell, Don Jones has a fantastic series with CBT Nuggets where he fully explores that. And Don Jones is a terrific guy, one of my favorite people, in fact. But anyway, let's go ahead and run this. I want to also run PowerShell. So I'm going to run a PowerShell command prompt. All I have to do is type it and then press enter. And then I want to run certain commands here that will allow me to find information about a remote machine. For example, what if I wanted to find out what services were stopped or what services were running on a remote computer? Well, I would type in what you're about to see here. And that is, I want to run a remote command. That's what the ICM is. It's pointing to a remote computer, which is the Windows 7 computer, Enterprise 64. I can also do fully qualified domain name if I want. And then a squiggly bracket, get service, where object, and then I'm pointing for looking for a status that is equal to running, and then close with squiggly brackets, and then press enter here, and then now I can see all of the services that are running on that remote destination. Might be very handy for me to see what's going on over there, to see if my antivirus service has suddenly stopped working, or the print service is not properly running. And that command that I just did there was for running, but I can also do stopped. Okay, something like that, for example, and that would show me any services that are available but that are not running. So very useful kind of a tool that way. And you can, again, plug in just about any kind of a get command or anything you want. These are actually called commandlets. And you can run a lot of these things and get a great deal of information about that remote system. How about another one for good measure? Let's do an ICM Win7 Enterprise again remotely. I want to get the processes. Maybe the user's complaining the system's running really slow, and I want to find out the top 10 items that are using CPU cycles. So I'm going to sort the object with the property of a CPU in descending order, and I want to select the top 10 of the first 10 items that are using CPU utilization here, and then I can identify which ones they are. So again, a very powerful tool. So anyway, I kind of jumped ahead of myself a little bit there, but we were talking there about PowerShell remote management. Again, this requires that you've already also run Windows Remote Management Quick Config, and then the syntax for that would be to point to a remote machine would be ICM, followed by the host name, and then whatever command you're using will be in these squiggly brackets. If I wanted to just run these same commands locally, I would emit. It would be coming out of my pores. I would get rid of this first part, and then I would get rid of the squiggly brackets. And then I would run just whatever the command was. Now, I also want to point out, I think I got it over here, that if you want to know a lot of the various Git commands, if you wanted to find out the certificates that are on that machine, if you wanted to find out, what hotfixes have been run on that machine, then go to this URL at TechNet to get the syntax for all of these different ones, including this one that I just showed you, one of the ones I just showed you here, for the service that we see here. In this nugget, we took a look at remote administration, where we started off by taking a look at remote assistance. This is where someone needs help, and you're the helper, whereas they're the host. The host will send an invitation out. You can accept it with a secret code, and then you can view their desktop and/or remotely control it with their permission. We took a look at remote desktop, where you can remotely connect to a destination machine and fully operate it as if you were seated there locally. We saw that you can use remote management. This gives you the ability with WinRM to be able to do command line utilities from one machine to a destination and get the results on your machine. We also saw that you can run Windows Remote PowerShell, which is a powerful scripting language that gives you a full range of administrative capabilities, both locally, but in this case we saw you can also use that remotely. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.